Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
We've been tackling some pretty serious spiritual issues in a fun way, I hope, this month. We looked at action versus non-action. Last week we looked at childlike versus childish, and today we're looking at knowing versus not knowing. Which do you value more? Knowing versus not knowing. And after thinking about it for a while, I figured out to me what is probably the most important answer I give as a minister. Because as a minister, you get asked a lot of different types of questions, and sometimes real challenging ones. And does anyone want to guess what that answer is?
I don't.
It's I don't know. I don't know. First of all, I think it's honest, and it's true. I don't know. What happens to my soul when I die? Why do bad things happen to good people? Will the Dodgers win the World Series this year? What am I going to do in this situation? I don't know. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't times where I don't have a strong intuition about things, and I might be partly right. But I think I don't know is such an important answer too, because it cultivates a kind of spirituality that doesn't rush to an answer. Because the thing about an answer or a seeming solution sometime, it can actually stop us from growing, from getting there ourselves. So sometimes I try to avoid answers because I enjoy a good dialogue. I enjoy connecting. I enjoy listening and seeing what happens from a good conversation. In Buddhism, they sometimes say that enlightenment is like a sharp diamond. Anyone might attain it, but if you don't have the right structure, it will cut right through you. It speaks to the idea that I want to share today, that we kind of have to build our understanding. We have to expand our wisdom. We have to learn to work on ourselves so that when we do find a solution or an answer, not only do we know it, but we understand it too. And getting to this place, we don't get there by being a know-it-all. We get there by being humble. We get there by being willing not to know. Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching tells us that not knowing is true knowledge. He says, the ancient masters didn't try to educate the people, but kindly taught them to not know. When they think that they know the answers, people are difficult to guide. In election years, isn't that especially true? When they know that they don't know, people can find their own way. If I don't know is the most important answer I think I can give as a minister, I think the most important question I can ask is, what do you think? What do you think? It helps us get past this model where one person doesn't know and another person does know, and someone asks a question and someone gives the answer and you go, oh, okay, that's it. I don't like that type of thinking, because the greatest realizations that we have in life, we often have with others. We often have in studying together. We often have by being willing to live in the question sometimes. I think that's what made Socrates the greatest philosopher who ever lived, is he never answered anything. He just asked questions. He saw people who really valued something like love or valued something like justice. And so he'd ask those people, well, what is love then? What is justice? And then those people had him killed. But the idea there is sometimes we have things that we value so much in life, but we really don't stop to think about what they really are, what they really mean. They say that one of Socrates' last spoken words before he was put to death, he said, don't worry about me. All of you walk around like death is the greatest curse. But how do you know that it isn't the greatest blessing? Always thinking, always questioning. And that's the wisdom of not knowing. Being willing to recognize that a good question can be better than even the finest answer at times. It can express in our lives in a great way. I love something that Martin Fisher said. He said, a conclusion is that place where you got tired of thinking. Yes, a conclusion is that place where you got tired of thinking. And I like that in the fun kind of business, creative sense, but I think it packs a punch when we apply it to our lives. Can you think of some conclusions that you may have come to about a relationship that you're in? A conclusion you've come to about yourself because how old you are or because you're too young? A conclusion that you've come to about your career, or perhaps a conclusion you've come to about your God. And these conclusions can be fine except when they limit the possibilities. A lot of us have placed periods in areas of our lives where there should be commas, semicolons, and a couple more periods to allow things to expand. And often where we find ourselves struggling in our lives most is where we've come to these conclusions that limit us. And by being willing to move into a place of not knowing, we sometimes can erase that period to see what can come forward. It sounds a little strange, but I do find it true that in pastoral counseling, when you're meeting with someone who's struggling, obviously there's a lot of issues and struggles taking place, but sometimes the root of it is a kind of boredom. Someone will come in and they'll say, I'm so unhappy with my relationship. Gosh, I know my husband so well. Gosh, do I know my husband. I know everything that he's thinking all of the time. I know what intimacy is like with him every time. I know every story that he's going to tell when we go out with the so-and-sos. And there might be truth to all of that, but at the same time, in order to expand or enhance our lives, we have to not know our partners so well. Maybe we listen to a story they've told 100 times and hear something new in it we haven't heard before. Dean's saying, yes. But maybe we share something new about ourselves. And we can apply this same type of conclusive thinking to our work, to ourselves, and especially, I think, our models of the divine. When you no longer have a God that can demonstrate a miracle in your life, you may have a tired kind of spirituality. When you no longer have a God that you can wake up and feel is right with you and walking with you in your affairs, you may have limited through your own understanding what the divine can do in your life. In my experience, there is no such thing as ordinary life. But there certainly is an ordinary thinking about our lives, a limited form of thinking that can keep us still. And it's in that limited thinking, it's in seeing our lives as so ordinary and mediocre that we start causing sometimes all these problems around us. I'm not saying we cause all our problems, don't get me wrong, but we sometimes feel the need to verge away from the beauty and the truth that is there. Another great Taoist philosopher, his name was Chuang Tzu. He's a little bit more wild than even Lao Tzu is. And there's a story that Chuang Tzu is fishing one day, and some members of the king's court come to court him to be an advisor to the king, a great honor. And Chuang Tzu thinks about it for a little while, and he says, is it true that the king has the shell of an ancient turtle, 1,000 years old, and that he keeps the shell of this turtle in the finest gold box, wrapped with the most beautiful of ribbons? And the king's court is very proud. Yes, this is true. And then Chuang Tzu asked them, tell me, if that turtle were still alive, do you think he'd be more proud to know that he was wrapped, his shell was wrapped in a golden box? Or do you think he'd prefer to be playing in the mud? Well, I guess the latter, the court tells him. And Chuang Tzu says to them, please tell the king that I say thank you, but I prefer to be right here with my tail in the mud. And I like that story because it speaks to this idea of how much sometimes we need to create something else because we haven't stopped to truly see the beauty of what is right and present for us today. Twain too once also said, he said, "You can't talk about the ocean with a frog who lives in a well. He is bounded by the space he inhabits." Do we know any well-dwelling frogs? You can't talk about ice with an insect who was born in June. He is bounded by a single season. You can't talk about the Tao with a person who thinks he knows something. He is bounded by his own beliefs. The Tao is vast and fathomless. You can understand only by stepping beyond the limits of yourself. Can we think about, through our so-called knowing, the kind of limits that we put upon ourselves? Ellen Langer, some of you may be familiar, is a great doctor and scientist who is a real champion of mindful living. And she really studies the role that not just effects in life have on us, but how our limited thinking can damage us in our lives. And that happens for us in so many ways, the ways that we limit ourselves. I'm too fat to go and do this. I'm too old to be trying that. I'm too young to be speaking up about this. And Langer especially focuses on the aging and folks getting older and all of the stigmas and judgments that the world seems to have about them, and all the stigmas and ideas that they often have about themselves. One of the most interesting studies that she did, and expansive, was called the counterclockwise study. She did it in 1979, and what she would do is take folks who were growing older, would test them, and then they would get to go on this retreat somewhere, and for a week to 2 weeks in that retreat center, it would be 20 years earlier. It would be 1959. And the participants were told just to have fun, but there weren't people there picking up things for them or caring for them. They were expected to be like they were in 1959 and to talk about the politics that was going on in 1959 and to go about some of their regular routines just like it was 1959. And the results from her study were quite impressive. She says, after each week-long retest was over, we retested participants and found that indeed the mind has enormous control over the body. Both groups had been treated with respect, engaged in lively discussions, and experienced a week unlike anything in their recent past. Langer goes on to say, it is not primarily our physical selves that limit us, but rather our mindset about our physical limits. Langer gives a more simple example of a family that's getting together to discuss whether or not to put mom into a assisted living center. And what had happened is mom had come home with some groceries, and no longer should she take the groceries, put them down on the floor, unlock the door, and pick up the groceries again to take them inside. Now, in any family, there might be a lot of different elements that go into a decision like this, but in this instance, Langer points out all of the judgments that the woman might have about herself and the family might have about aging and the fears and anxieties, and she thinks that so much we get into our knowing about these things that we forget to think about a question simply asked, what if we built a shelf and put it underneath the wall or wherever it may be, so she could place her groceries at a place where she didn't have to lean down and get them and walk inside. Now again, all sorts of things contribute to pain we may be in or things that are going on in our lives, but we should never allow them to limit our ability to see things afresh, to see things anew, because not through that knowing, but sometimes through that not knowing, that openness, we can invite so much new into our lives. Langer says, too many of us believe the world is to be discovered rather than a product of our own construction and thus to be invented. I want to share with everyone today 3 ways that we can actively not know. 3 ways that you can actively not know in your life. I think that's why a lot of us resist not knowing, because it sounds like doing nothing and that sounds too boring, and so if we do, we're going to create a bunch of trouble for ourselves. But there are some ways that we can actively not know. And the first is through listening. Listen. Always remember what Mark Twain said, it is better to let people think you're dumb than to speak and remove all doubt, right? So when we allow ourselves to practice listening, we're able to even change our minds sometimes. We can hear what people have to say around us. Again, when someone tells a story we've heard 100 times, we can hear something new in it. We can recognize ourselves in it. By deeper listening, the enchantment, indeed, the magic of the reality around us can begin to reveal itself, and all that it requires is we let the busyness of our minds and our mouths go. Lao Tzu says, those who know don't talk. Those who talk don't know. Close your mouth, block off your senses, blunt your sharpness, untie your knots, soften your glare, settle your dust. This is primal identity. A second way that we can actively not know in our lives is by consciously living in the mystery. It is so challenging for us sometimes to walk on our path and not know, and even more challenging not to predict what's around the corner. Predicting what's around the corner is great if you're writing horror movies or things like that, all of the impending dooms that we sometimes place around that corner. But to me, true courage is to be willing to walk your path in a state of openness, to not worry about what's around the corner, to have discernment, yes, but to be willing to know that you don't know, to be in that mystery. And it is through, in my experience, the best epiphanies and realizations that I've ever had come from being willing to not know, to live in the mystery of what is present, to see what might reveal itself to me, as opposed to me always trying to inform my world and everyone in it on how they should be. It's a powerful way to live, to be willing to live in the mystery. Lao Tzu says, if you close your mind in judgments and trap it with desires, your heart will be troubled. If you keep your mind from judging and aren't led by the senses, your heart will find peace. Seeing into darkness is clarity. Knowing how to yield is strength. Use your own light and return to the source of light. This is called practicing eternity. A third, and to me probably the most important way to actively not know in your life is to practice trust. To practice trust. The easiest thing to do when we are childlike, but the hardest thing to do when we are grown up and childish, right? To trust. Doesn't mean don't have discernment, but to be able to trust is to be able to give ourselves the environment in which to grow and create. We have so many wise people in our congregations, and one of them is Lynn Wainfan. I should have told her I was quoting her. We make sure she was here at church today. But it was so cool. I was giving a talk on trust several months ago, and Lynn, who's a rocket scientist for real, comes up to me at the end and she goes, "Oh, I'd love to hear your talk on trust. I wrote a book about trust." And I said, "Oh, all right." So she gave it to me, and there's a great quote in it I love. I'm not through it yet, but I think we have a copy or two at the bookstore. She says, "Distrust grinds you down like sand wears down an engine. Once you have a high trust environment, life is golden. It's less wearing, more productive, and more fun. If you and I improve trust in this world, even just a little, well, that's something." That's a big part of removing some of those conclusions in our lives, because many of those conclusions we've come to in order to protect ourselves. A lot of those periods are where we wanted to stop thinking. We don't want to go beyond that. But if we can build trust in ourselves again, and build trust in life again, and then look at trusting people again, we can start to grow again. We can start to evolve again. We can start to deepen again. If the best answer I give in ministry is "I don't know," and the best question is "What do you think?" I think the most important thing I do in ministry with people is trust. Trust them to know what is best for them, to make the highest decisions for themselves, to have the right realizations for themselves without me thinking I need to provide them for them, without me falling into the egotistical trap, which feels so good sometimes to be called upon and have a correct answer, but to step back and give folks space. That's sometimes the greatest act of love we can do for anyone in our lives, is to trust them. There's something else, a term that we often use in spirituality that I think we often misunderstand, and the term is to know the truth. Know the truth. For some of us, to know the truth, we think it means to know the answer, to know the answer in our lives. But to me, what it really means is trust God. To know the truth doesn't mean I know the solution, I know how things are supposed to work. It means to trust God. So when someone says to me, oh, I have this challenging thing coming up, I say I will know the truth for you. That doesn't mean I know what's going to happen. It means that I trust that there's no such thing as God hand, that there's a divine presence in your life. It means that when I'm facing difficulty and challenges with what is before me in my life, and I say I know the truth, it doesn't mean I know what the answer is going to be, but I know that there is a divine presence that is right here and right now helping to guide me. I think learning to live actively not knowing in our lives can help create the foundation for so much more wisdom and, just like Lynn said in her quote, fun, building that trust. Now I want to close with a kind of complex point, but in talking about Taoism and reading the Tao Te Ching, I think it's kind of important, and it's this way of living that comes about when we're willing to know when we're called to know and not know when we're called to not know. And it's a quality that in Taoism we call non-being, that we always are in touch with what is being in our lives and what is material, but sometimes we get so caught up in the material that we forget about the immaterial. We listen to the words, but we forget about the space in between them that gives them effect. We appreciate our physical body, but we sometimes appreciate it so much that we forget that we have a soul. One of the things that Lao Tzu says, he says, if you close... No, that's what he said earlier. He said, we join spokes together in a wheel, but it is the center hole that makes the wagon move. We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want. We hammer wood for a house, but it is the inner space that makes it livable. We work with being, but non-being is what we use. There are many different translations of the Tao Te Ching, and I think this is such a good point. I'm going to read a different translation by Ursula Le Guin, who said, 30 spokes meet in the hub. Where the wheel isn't is where it's useful. Hollowed out clay makes a pot. Where the pot's not is where it's useful. Cut doors and windows to make a room. Where the room isn't, there's room for you. So the profit in what is in the use of what isn't. When you can be aware of the non-being in your life, that space, I think we begin to, in a sense, return ourselves back to ourselves. We realize and embrace our material being. We all should. It's a beautiful thing. But we should not forget the immaterial aspects of ourselves, the essentialism of our own consciousness. And when we reclaim that in our lives and see it in the people and the lives around us, we begin to live in harmony with the Tao, with God, with Spirit, and with the heart of our own being. When we are in touch with that wellspring, we find ourselves in touch with an endless source. So may we receive that source with more gladness and allow it to become. So thank you for your time. Thanks for not knowing with me.